So Ghost of Yotei is almost exactly 1 month away, and I have a big question. Will it be anywhere near as interesting as Ghost of Tsushima, or will it be another cookie-cutter revenge story? Let's dig into it. So we are about a month away from Ghost of Yotei, and I am really excited to talk about this game, and it's something I really do want to talk about. I am all about story, so that's where I'm going to start. My name is Subtext. I do long breakdowns of video game stories, and I really want to focus in on the story, and then we'll talk gameplay about Ghost of Yotei. So one of the things about Ghost of Yotei is that in just watching the trailers, it looked like a pretty straightforward revenge story, but the devs have gone out of their way to say multiple times now that the revenge story is just the starting point for all of this. And they talked about it in several interviews in print and video, and so let's actually watch one right now.
Our story of revenge is a classic in samurai cinema, but it's just the first step in this long tale of Atsu going from this broken lone wolf to assembling a wolf pack, and she changes. Her identity is the Onryo moving through the land where people grow to fear her and love her. It's its own experience. We can't wait for people to play it. Of course, we don't want to give away story details, but I can tell you that her quest for revenge is the start. It's absolutely not the whole thing.
Right there.
It's a great start.
So to them, they're really emphasizing this is just the start of the whole revenge arc, that the revenge isn't the whole story. And that actually was really reassuring to me, especially when I started to think about Ghost of Tsushima. So Ghost of Tsushima, on the surface is a story about like pushing back on, tradition and honor and like finding a different way when sort of the traditional honorable route of the samurai doesn't quite work, right? But there are a lot of like shades and interesting details that are unpacked all throughout that story that really dig into the idea of that overall theme of honor. So it seems very straightforwardly about the value of honor and family and all that, which is kind of like the big end point of that game, without spoiling anything major for anybody who hasn't played it by any chance, but you should. And the real thing about that story is that the thing that Ghost of Tsushima does really well is that even if on the surface it's kind of a straightforward story of like questioning sort of your upbringing and the way that the traditional systems work, it explores that in a lot of different and interesting ways in a lot of the details of how they bring that to life. And there are a lot of like sub-themes within that story that make it feel really just well told, even though it is in a lot of ways relatively straightforward in terms of the overall arc that Jin goes from samurai to ghost. And a lot of those shades and details are like unpacked all throughout the story in like these nice little ways. Like for example, Khotun Khan really exploits the rigidity of their traditions and their entire way of life, and it really propels and allows the Mongols to take over Tsushima the way that they do in the original game, or in the first game. And he even talks about it outright in the scene where he kills Lord Adachi. He talks about, I learned your language and I learned your way of life and all these details of like, I learned about how you work. And it's because of that I can defeat you.
Do you know how I prepared for today? I learned. I know your language, your traditions, your beliefs, which villages to tame and which to burn. So I'll ask you once again, Samurai, do you surrender?
It's because of that you can ride up here expecting a traditional showdown, and instead I can throw fire on you, burn you alive, and throw away all customs and traditions and take over your entire island, which happens in Tsushima. So really the genesis of that story is you have this invading clan of outsiders who behave like outsiders, and completely overthrow the way Tsushima works. And Jin sort of embraces that, right? Because once your enemy is not observing your traditions, doesn't give a shit about your traditions, and outright exploits that to, take over your land and kill your people, it pushes Jin to say, okay, well, I'm also going to shed some of those traditions because we need to adopt some of these other ones in order to sort of win, right? So he takes on the identity of the ghost over time and does things that are a little morally questionable, but in line with the idea of the ghosts. And he uses it to really take advantage of them. And at one point, something that he does is flipped on him. And so it just shows that slippery slope, right? So there are people, who are on his side, who are a little more traditional, like parts of his family, who question sort of that approach and becoming the ghost. And it's because that slippery slope, is kind of dangerous. Jin uses it and is impacted by it in a negative way. So, you really explore all sides of that question. And then there are a lot of additional little stories all throughout Ghost of Tsushima that make it even more interesting. So stuff like Ryuzo and the Straw Hats and what desperation drives them to do, or like grief in Lady Masako's story, or faith in Norio's story, or like classism and social mobility in Yuna's story. All of those are explored within Ghost of Tsushima, and add layers and depths to what is otherwise a pretty straightforward story about honor, the meaning of it, will you uphold it? And so when I think about them saying that the revenge is just a starting point for Ghost of Yotei, I can see how they can pay that off given what they did in Tsushima. And also because, they can flip it based on one of their big inspirations as a studio, which they talked about in this clip.
Obviously, there is quite a few of those games. What would you say is the thing that really sets the Ghost of Tsushima, Ghost of Yotei series apart from those other entries or those other spins on it? What do you think is the
asking about Assassin's Creed Shadows and things like that?
Sucker Punch samurai game.
What is different about them?
I think Nate and I might have different ones, but I think it's really the film inspired sort of poetic sort of film inspiration.
I would say that it's the inspired by these classic samurai films. That is a North Star that keeps us moving forward. And in Ghost of Yotei, there is a bit of a wrinkle in that. It's a lawless wilderness, and there are a lot of sellswords up there at the time. So the place is extremely dangerous.
So and the sellsword thing, take a note of that. So that samurai film inspiration for them actually comes to life through two big films that I think were inspirations for them. The first being Yojimbo, and the second being Lady Snowblood. I think both of those films have a lot in their DNA that seems to be sort of in the crux of how the developers have talked about Ghost of Yotei. So the reason why both of these films have such shared DNA with Ghost of Yotei is that they're both lone wolf stories. So in Yojimbo, the protagonist doesn't even really go by a name. At one point he's asked and he sort of looks into the distance and he calls himself, I think it's something like 30 years old, cherry blossoms or something like that. And he's just looking at the thing in the distance from him, and he's just naming that. So he doesn't even give his name. And that was actually an inspiration for the whole Man with No Name trilogy for Clint Eastwood. And then Lady Snowblood is this solo mission of vengeance, which was the inspiration for, or one of the main inspirations for Kill Bill. So these are two classic stories, but they each have their own sort of spin on the traditional samurai stories. So in Yojimbo, the interesting layer to that is that Sanjuro, who's the hero, arcs from being this wandering sellsword like Atsu into someone who's willingly protects the people. So he goes from being very distant and sort of just observing these clash between these different clans, and then actively involves himself and sacrifices and risks himself within that story. And we see the developers talk about a similar aspect of growth coming from Atsu, and not just it being solely about the story of vengeance. And they talk about her going from being this like lone wolf to building a wolf pack. So much like Yojimbo builds allies and support in this community, we also see potentially Atsu going through the same thing with like her building her wolf pack, right? Which they showed in the menu system for like the wolf pack who will come and like help you and support you. It's a very similar thing. And they talk about it here in this interview with Radio Times Gaming, where they dig into and sort of like tease that aspect of the story.
As well as getting to know a new hero. Atsu is very much her own character that players will get to know and get to see her change as she becomes infamous around Ezo as this Onryo, this vengeance ghost. The experience of watching her grow and become kind of a weapon master, the player gets to become a weapon master too, as well as transforming from a lonely lone wolf to having this wolf pack around her, is the story that we really wanted to give people.
Again, very similar to Yojimbo.
It's something that you don't know the details of because it's fresh.
So as they mentioned, Atsu sort of grows this legend as a vengeful spirit, as an Onryo, and that really reflects their other big inspiration, most likely, of Lady Snowblood. Much like Atsu, she's considered sort of this vengeful spirit. I think she's called an Asura demon, and that's how she's described in the film. And so it very much is, you know, if you saw Kill Bill, there's a lot of like relevance in terms of very similar things, even similar like shots in Lady Snowblood compared to Kill Bill, of these people who wronged her and then her going after those people. But Lady Snowblood is interesting because while Kill Bill sort of like revels in the vengeance in a way, Lady Snowblood really digs into a much more tragic tale that complicates all that revenge. So, you know, some of her targets, who she doesn't even really know personally, she just knows that they wronged her family. When she meets them, they aren't just cartoonish monsters. And there's a bit of a hint that they're doing something similar with Lord Saito from one of the trailers where he says this.
I'm sorry it came to this, little wolf.
So the delivery of that line actually does seem to convey a sense of like genuine regret that he's having to do this to this like little wolf, right? And it seems like he's reluctant in a way, but it's come to this, right? Whatever the circumstances were that surrounded everything kind of like led to this. And there's something similar to the potential sympathies that we see with some of the villains in Lady Snowblood. And what we also find is that like the lives of these like targets that she's going after are really intertwined with others who are, you know, not guilty, who are innocent in all of this, and who Lady Snowblood kind of builds relationships for and cares for. And so that kind of complicates everything a little bit more. And there's a potential hint of that in the original announcement trailer.
And now, every Ronin here is after you.
Still think you're the hunter?
Such a badass like response. And then she just kills the guy. So he's bringing up something where he's kind of asking the question, right? Of like, you came here to be the hunter, but are you sure that you're still the hunter? Much like Lady Snowblood, she still kills this guy. But it starts to pose an interesting question, right? Like, as she builds this reputation, who then comes after her and why? You know, is it just perpetuating the same thing that sent her after these people? And so it starts to like ask those questions that starts to get into like the moral messiness of something like Lady Snowblood, where it starts out as this like obvious revenge tale and then sort of like slowly descends into not being exactly what you thought as you get to know some of the targets that she goes after and some of the complexities of the relationships around those targets, and kind of what it does to her. So it's a very, you know, interesting way to sort of explore, you know, that very straightforward kind of concept And it all complicates what seems like a clear, justified, revenge story with aspects that she just might be blind to. And there's a potential hint of that in one of the trailers. So I'm getting into speculation zone. But one of the things I really enjoy doing is like taking lines that are out of context in some trailers and potentially trying to find out what the context is, since they don't show it in the trailer. So in the official release date trailer, they had this moment where Atsu talks about something that may actually play out differently in the game than I assumed based on how it's presented in the trailers. It's a lone wolf.
I knew. Why do you always call me that? It means one who is easily lost in the hunt.
It mentions being lost in the hunt. And right at the end of the trailer,
I have to go home. Back where all this started.
this mention of I have to go home, back where it all started. So that made me think of another possibility of like the context around that line. So what if that moment, which seems like it might be the beginning of the story, where she's like, I need to go back home, see where it all started, get sort of the revenge juice in a way. I think it might play out differently, where that return back home might also be to sort of like see something that she didn't notice before from the past, right? So to reflect on something maybe that she learns about the circumstances that led to her family's death, that may like complicate the story a little bit more. So I'm hopeful that they're able to sort of like add a whole lot of color to the story and dimension, even if it still lives in that same, base of a revenge story. It can go kind of beyond that original point, especially if they borrow from these like film inspirations like Yojimbo or Lady Snowblood. So I'm very hopeful about where they can go with the story, and that it won't just be as cut and dry as it seems at first glance. So another thing I want to talk about comes from this Reddit post, actually, in the Ghost of Tsushima subreddit, where somebody brought up the fact of Mount Yotei in 1603 and the Ainu. So in this post, it was like right around the time of the like original announcement when they mentioned the game is going to be set in 1603. Basically, this guy, poses as like, or says they're a Japanese history buff, and so the Mount Yotei, as it exists today, didn't actually exist until sometime this century. I think it was in the 50s or 60s. He doesn't say here, but Mount Yotei, like that wasn't the name of the mountain back in 1603 when this game is set. And there's a whole lot of like history around like, this is where the Ainu lived. They're not ethnically Japanese. And so it wasn't really technically part of Japan. So this person was just asking, TLDR, Mount Yotei was populated by the indigenous Ainu, not the Japanese, during 1603, meaning it was not part of feudal Japan. I hope the game does the Ainu justice and doesn't minimize or ignore their existence. And I think, luckily, I don't think that's going to happen. And there are potentially even other interesting story elements that could make this more than what we think it is, based on that the choice of 1603, what the developers know about Mount Yotei area in 1603, and some interesting thoughts that came up from another post about how this can all build into the story. So let's start with what the developers actually knew. So in the original blog post announcing Ghost of Yotei, the developers mentioned, we can reveal that Atsu's journey takes place in 1603, more than 300 years after the events of Ghost of Tsushima. Our story is set in the land surrounding Mount Yotei, a towering peak in the heart of Ezo, an area of Japan known as Hokkaido in the present day. In 1603, this area was outside the rule of Japan and filled with sprawling grasslands, snowy tundras, and unexpected dangers. It's a far cry from the organized samurai clans who lived in Tsushima, and it's a setting for an original story we can't wait to tell. So the developers knew, and as part of this announcement post, that in 1603 it was, on the outside of the rule of Japan. So they're aware sort of the cultural context and the historical context of, who was living there, how attached it was to Japan or not. So to the concern that was in their Reddit post, I think they're aware of that. And there was another post by someone else who brought up that they might actually be using the reality of that in order to sort of like tell a more interesting story and social commentary in this like form of historical fiction that actually specifically highlights the Ainu. So I've watched several interviews, and the developers have continually talked about like spending time with the Ainu people and with like, you know, getting immersed really in the culture. And specifically, they've talked about how they really wanted to sort of do respect to the Ainu people. So I think we're seeing, and there's a lot of like mentions of like inspirations that have come through based on their experience with the Ainu. So in this article, a Japanese scholar points out an error in Ghost of Yotei's title, but it could be intentional. It talks about this tweet thread from this Japanese scholar named Itsuji Tenjiku, who talks about the inaccuracy of like Yotei, that not being the name of the mountain in 1603, and why that might be intentional. So he talks about the history of the name here. To be honest, it kind of goes over my head a little bit. But what I found interesting was, that's to say, historically, the mountain has only been called Yotei by Japanese people since the Meiji period started in 1868. Hence, Yotei in 1603 is a ghost place name. As a scholar knowledgeable of the culture and language of Ainu, the natives who lived in the northern part of Japan, he continues to illustrate what the year setting of the game could hint. 1603 was the year before 1604, when the Matsume domain guaranteed the Edo shogunate the exclusive right to trade with the Ainu. From this point on, the Ainu's superiority began to crumble little by little. So it then continued, in the next 2 centuries, the Ainu's homeland, Hokkaido, which is the setting for Ghost of Yotei, gradually declined to become a fishery under colonization. Undoubtedly, the year 1603 marks the eve of the group's decline due to colonization. Therefore, according to Tenjiku, the title of the sequel could be satirizing colonialism. It's unclear if the story would evolve around the revenge of the Ainu people. However, what Tenjiku has speculated to some extent aligns with the developer's description of the narrative as they describe it as an underdog vengeance. There's just something interesting here about sort of the potential setting and the real world history of the Ainu, what happened to the Ainu, how they lived on the border of Japan, and sort of like what happened to that area. And specifically choosing to use Yotei, which is also just easier to pronounce than the original name at the time. They may get into some of that sort of the state of Hokkaido, and I wonder if that those elements of like going beyond just a revenge tale, if it comes to Atsu sort of like finding this new home in a way. They talk in the blog post announcing the game. It would be more than just a revenge story, and eventually it becomes about Atsu finding new purpose. And so I wonder if, you know, learning about the region, what's really befallen these people, and helping these people, you know, beyond just her revenge tale, is really the broader scope of the story and how it helps go beyond sort of the tropes of what you would expect out of a story, like a revenge story like this, and how this might just be, how revenge might just be the starting point of a much bigger story. So there's a lot of really interesting things here. And actually another fun fact about the name of Yotei. So from the PlayStation blog, where they were talking about sort of like how Sucker Punch chose Hokkaido for the game setting, they mentioned this little fun fact about the name Yotei. So while traveling in another part of Hokkaido, we were introduced to a mountain so tall it seemed to be watching over everyone on the island. You guessed it, it was Mount Yotei, which the Ainu call the female mountain. Of course, on the trip we've been thinking a lot about our hero. Hearing the Ainu name for the mountain really bonded it to Atsu. For us, Yotei became a symbol of Hokkaido, while for Atsu is a symbol of home and of the family she lost. This process of being there, talking about the game with locals, then synthesizing new ideas is what made the trip so fulfilling. So this is their actual reference photo of Mount Yotei. But again, speaking of like those other themes and how she may become more involved with the people of Hokkaido, and sort of really be invested in that beyond just the, you know, the revenge tale. There's maybe something to the fact that they, you know, they looked at this reference of the female mountain and how it seemed to really watch over everyone on the island. So again, doing a bit of speculating, but thinking that that may become the role of Atsu in the story, to sort of like, you know, they said it binded Atsu to this mountain, the meaning of the mountain, and how they viewed the mountain. So it could be this like symbol of like what she represents to the people of Yotei by the end of the entire story. So again, this all gets me very excited about where they could take the story, how it can go beyond sort of the general tropes of revenge. And it could be a really interesting sort of like adventure and story. Definitely, you know, very different from Ghost of Tsushima and Jin's story. But again, I kind of love that. I love the fact that it's going to be its own story, its own unique thing, an entirely new kind of character and setting. You know, we have a lot of sequels that sort of like take place in the same exact place, from like Tears of the Kingdom to, you know, even like God of War, you know, and people kind of get tired of that like similarity from game to game. So I'm very happy that they're sort of exploring new territory with Ghost of Yotei. And so that takes us to also gameplay. So I have bad news. I did talk about gameplay, but it was like another 20 minutes. So I decided to split that into another video dedicated to some of the things I've seen in their conversations and in the developer interviews about some of the decisions that they tried to make and had to balance when it came to the gameplay. So that'll be a separate video. But if you enjoyed this, please hit the like and subscribe on this channel. It's my second channel from my main channel where I do like longer video essays. And this one's dedicated to more like casual conversations like this, hence the title Unscripted. And I will be doing a stream of Ghost of Yotei on twitch.tv/subtext. That's subtxt. So I'll be doing a live stream there when the game comes out. So please follow over on Twitch as well. And I will see you when the game comes out in about a month.